Hi there and welcome to I'll Knit and Spin If I Want To. I'm Andrea Maury of Drea Renee Knits, and this is where I try my best to answer some of your questions. And I realized it'd been a little while since I told you how you can go about asking a question. So depending on if you're watching this on your phone or computer or an iPad, it'll be different on each one. But let's say you're watching this on a computer, which is probably the easiest. When you look below the video, there is, typically it says something like the title of the episode, I'll Knit and Spin If I Want To, episode 45. And next to it, it'll say show more with like a little arrow, or it might say show description. And you just tap that and it'll drop down. That's where I put in like all the questions I've answered this week. That's where I put all the links. So all the links to like what I'm wearing or things I might mention during an episode, like the needle case. If you are one of the many who are like, what's the needle case you use? I always make sure to link things like that. At least I try really hard to remember in those show notes. So by the way, it's the Maxwell by Magpie Fibers. If you're like, but tell me what it is. It's also where I put the link to ask questions. And it's the best way to ask a question because I basically every week before I film these, I pull up through that form. It all goes into a spreadsheet for me. And I use that form to pick the question. So if you've emailed me or thrown it into the comments, I always forget to it's just gonna get buried. So use the form, and that's the best way. There's also a link to my newsletter. So if you don't subscribe to my newsletter, I send typically about one a week, and that is the best way to be the first to know about my pattern releases. It's also the only place I offer discounts, except for I think there's like maybe one, maybe two public sales I do a year that I post about all over the place. So it's definitely the best place to go if you want to save a couple dollars on patterns. And I also share things like recipes, things I like the needle case. I like to share books I'm reading and all kinds of fun stuff. So if you have not subscribed, you can also do that below. And if you are on your phone, usually if you look right below the video, it's not, for me, as visually easy to see, but it's usually just like a little tiny arrow that you can tap and it'll drop down. So just start tapping things and hopefully you'll find it. Okay. Oh, and today I am wearing Velvet Mirror. This is my first pattern of 2022. I showed you a sneak peek in last week's episode, but it came out this Tuesday. And I am super stoked to be all snuggled up in it today because right now there are fluffy flakes falling from the sky and I'm so happy. If you haven't been here long, fluffy snowflakes are pretty much one of my most favorite things in the world. It's why I have to live where there is winter because I just love a fluffy flake. I should have named this Fluffy Flake. I'm gonna write that down. That's a good pattern name. Fluffy Flakes. Right? Yeah, I'm gonna tuck that away. So it is named Velvet Mirror because it was inspired by another pattern of mine called Pink Velvet, which is a yoked sweater pattern. And the velvet was inspired by the incredibly soft, fuzzy, delightful Surrey alpaca. That gives it this like beautiful texture and halo. Oh yeah, you can see it right there. And I paired it with, and that is from Ching Fiber, and I paired it with Spin Cycles Nocturne, which is like the really moody, stark, curious sister. I think I'm curious about her. She could be curious too. Anyways, of Dyed in the Wool. So it has that really lovely color shifting that just brings a color work to life. And mirror is because if you actually look closely, when you just look at it, there's something going on, but it's kind of hard to figure out what. And it's actually that I swapped the main color on each half of the cowl. So one half uses the Surrey alpaca as the main color, and then the other half uses the Spin Cycle Nocturne. So anyways, it just gave it this really subtle effect that makes you go, wait, but like not necessarily know why. You know what I'm saying? It's like when you put a little cinnamon in a savory dish and you're like, what is that? That special something. And today I am also wearing my wrinkly stripes pullover, which I released, is it 2 years now? Man, time has just become this weird thing in the past couple years. But this is the Farmer's Daughter Fibers, her Recollect. But I also, while I was knitting this, and I just want to urge you to do the same because it's so fun. She had just come up with Recollect, this yarn base, which is a sport weight rambouillet. I don't know if I'm saying rambouillet right. And I love it. It is, I think it's a 2-ply, and it is a delightful sweater yarn. And I love the color palette, and I was knitting it, and I had recently done another sweater that used the Farmer's Daughter Fibers Surrey alpaca, which is called Odang. And I had the 3 leftover balls of it hanging out in a yarn basket, and I just like happened to glance over, and I just knew. I knew I just had to throw it in there and add it to the striped sweater. And so the brighter blue, corally red, and this mustard yellow, those are all Odang, and then the rest is just Recollect. And it adds this surprising just of fuzzy goodness and texture, and the dye takes to that base differently than the Recollect. And so it adds like this brightness. It's just fun. So, you know, my whole point is don't be afraid to break the rules. Like, even if you're following a pattern, sorry, I've got to stop wiggling around while I do these, shaking my camera. You know, even if you're following a pattern, there's no rules against throwing in a couple stripes of a random yarn that's hanging out in your knitting basket, you know, like just try it out, see what happens. So anyways, that's what I'm wearing. Velvet mirror cowl and stripes pullover and another floor length dress to get me through another chilly day. And so let's answer some questions. All right, question number 1. I'm sure you've been getting this question a bazillion times since your velvet mirror pattern was released, but can you tell us anything about the sweater that you're wearing with it in the pattern photos? I can't. I actually meant to say so in my newsletter and forgot. And so I have had a bazillion questions of like, what's the sweater? So that was a sneak peek of a new sweater. Its name is Metamorphic, and it is coming out super soon. So again, sign up for my newsletter, and yeah, I'm really excited about it. So if you haven't seen, you can go check out some photos either on the pattern page for the velvet mirror cowl, which is linked at the end of the show notes below, or you can see it on Instagram too if you want to see the sweater I'm talking about. But yeah, it is my new favorite sweater, and I almost wore it today, but I was like, okay, I should wait for the release. But yeah, I'm super excited about that. All right, next question. I have 6 skeins of color coordinating yarn, and it's all single ply, half superwash merino and silk, so I'm guessing half of each. I really want to make a garment. I don't know what pattern to use with it though. Any patterns you recommend? I'd also like you to explain how single ply behaves when knitted up. Also, if you have used any yarn involving silk and its characteristics and behaviors when knitted. Thank you so much. So I loved this question. I love that it's multifaceted. It is, and there's a lot to actually consider here. So let's start with the ply. So single ply. Single ply yarns are not plied at all. They are a single strand of yarn. Too bad I don't have one right here. But just imagine. Here I have a random little thing. So this is the dredges of some hand spun, and so we can actually untwist right here. So this would be kind of like, I never know how to get this thing to focus. Maybe if I tap. Is it focusing? No, it's focusing on my hand. Anyways, a single ply yarn is one that has only one strand of yarn. So you can see I've separated this. So that's 2 plies, and they get twisted together to make a 2-ply yarn. So a single ply yarn would be just one of these, not twisted with anything else. So a couple characteristics to think about single ply yarns. One is they are going to be one of the most fragile of yarns. They will pill. They're not going to have as much strength because the more twist a yarn receives, the stronger it's going to get. The more plies in a yarn, the stronger it's going to get. Like, you could test that yourself. You can probably take that singles yarn and break it really easily with your hands. But now if you went and grabbed like a 5 or 6 ply, maybe sock yarn, there are some that you cannot break them with your hands. You have to use scissors. So the integrity there is going to be weakened. Now, once you knit with that yarn, that strengthens it. But it still, in general, will ply or will pill and just not have as much strength as a plied yarn is going to be. For that reason, a lot of people will not knit a garment, a sweater, out of single ply yarn because they're going to be worried about it wearing out too quickly at the stress points like elbows and things like that. That being said, I have knit single ply sweaters a couple times, including pink velvet that uses this Surrey alpaca, but I paired it with a singles yarn that was merino, silk, and yak. And it has held up quite well. And that is where your silk portion of that yarn blend is really going to come in handy. Silk is a really long fiber, and because of that, it doesn't take nearly as much twist to give it strength. So that silk's gonna help the fragility of the otherwise not as strong single ply. And another thing to consider with single ply, I'm guessing this is a commercial yarn, so it's probably going to be fine, but I see this quite often in brioche especially. I think it's just obvious because brioche is a ribbed fabric and people will see their brioche slanting in one way and they're like, why is it slanting? Well, brioche looks really beautiful knit up in single ply yarns, but the thing about a plied yarn is when the singles are spun, so one strand of that yarn is spun, you spin that in one direction. So let's just say clockwise. We're going to spin it all clockwise. Then when you combine it with another strand of yarn and you ply them together, you're then going to go in the opposite direction. And so what that does is the original yarns that are just by themselves have all this energy going that way, but then once they get twisted back on to each other, it helps balance that twist back out so that the yarn can be straight again instead of just leaning really strongly with all that energy to one direction. So you might see some biasing in a project, and by biasing, just leaning of your stitches in a project that is done with a single ply yarn. I don't think it doesn't tend to be too bad with a commercial yarn, except for maybe in some really obvious stitch patterns like brioche. Again, a lot of times with blocking and as you're wearing it, it's not that big of a deal, but it's definitely something to consider. Again, especially if you're knitting a garment, you don't want something that kind of pulls funny along your body. That could be uncomfortable. And yeah, so silk adds strength. Silk is a strong fiber. Again, it has a long staple length. And so that is going to add strength to whatever you knit with that yarn. Silk can be a great addition to socks, to a sock yarn for strength, especially if you're trying to avoid nylon. If you care about something like that, silk can be really, really helpful for that. So yeah, silk is also shiny. Depending on how much silk is in your yarn, I would assume if that your yarn is a 50-50 blend, that it probably has a really nice sheen to it. So that's something to think about, is it will reflect the light more, and yeah, kind of shiny and bright. It probably has some nice drape. So all things to consider if you are worried about the integrity of that yarn in a sweater. It would probably be really, really lovely for a shawl. All right, next question. And I will put pink velvet down below as if you wanted to check that out. because then you can see an example of a sweater I knit with a yarn that was wool and silk, but with some yak thrown in, but it was a singles. All right, next question. My question pertains to changing yarn while working in the round. Whenever I am working stripes in the round, when I switch to a new color, my yarn join looks horrible. It is either too tight and bunches up, or I end up with a gaping hole. So I am gonna go ahead and link for you my Jogless Stripes tutorial. I use it generally for all my stripes unless I happen to have something like a faux seam where it's gonna hide the join and it doesn't matter. But it is so easy, and I find it does a really nice join. Let me describe that first, and then I've got a question for you, not that you can respond to me in real time, but something to think about. So for the Jogless Stripes, all you do is you are done with one color, you join in your next, you just knit around per usual, but then when you get to the second round of your new color, that very first stitch of the round, instead of just knitting that first stitch, you're going to pull up the right leg of the stitch below, which should be your previous color, and you just pop that up on your needle and you knit those two strands together, and it pulls up that bottom leg. And what it does is, when we knit in the round, we're not knitting in a perfect circle, we're actually knitting on a spiral, and so that's why it lifts up. It makes your first and last round of every stripe look kind of broken because you're not in a perfect circle. But when you lift up that stitch from below, it helps even out that spiral visually for us. I did it with this sweater, which I'm like, you can't see behind me, but it works really, really well, and it's so simple. You know, it's not too tricky to do. It's not gonna break up your knitting rhythm. But I linked it below in case you need a visual. Now, the other thing I would be curious about, because you said too tight, bunches up, or has a gaping hole. So this makes me think that maybe when it's too tight or bunching up, is maybe when you're carrying yarn up for stripes. So maybe you're just alternating two colors, so you are just carrying up the other color on the inside across those stripes. So something to consider there is, how wide are your stripes? I generally would consider, if you're having issues with it bunching or being too tight, that maybe you're just trying to carry that yarn up too far, and you'd be better off just breaking it and weaving in those ends. Or you just really need to be cognizant of leaving that loose enough when you're carrying it up. If you have gaping holes, that to me sounds like that's when your yarn, you're either then overcompensating, so you're doing it too loose when carrying that yarn up between stripes, or it could be when you're breaking the yarn, but that you can so easily fix with weaving in ends. So if you are struggling with bunching up or big holes, you might just want to default to breaking the yarn for each stripe and weaving in those ends, because then you can make everything pretty tidy with your weaving in. The only time I would not do that is if you're changing color like every other row or every 2, even 3 rows. That is a lot of ends to weave in. And for me, I would rather work on my tension carrying that yarn up than have to weave in all those ends. So just kind of consider what's going to give you the result you're going to be the happiest with. All right. So I think this question was spurred on by one of the questions from last week about knitting around little kids. How did you manage to start your business with an 8-month-old? So I think it's part of my nature. I started working when I was 13, and I was really excited. My husband and I made the decision that even though it put a large financial strain on us, it was really challenging those early years, we decided to try to have me home to raise our babies. And so that's what we did. And I was not working anymore, but I realized pretty quickly, you know, I think I had kind of this specific idea of what it would be like to be a stay-at-home parent. And I learned a lot about myself in that first year. and how much of my identity was tied up into work and being a good worker, how much joy I got from work. You know, once I was home with our daughter, I lost a little bit of who I was, and it was very lonely. I don't think that people prepare you for that, especially if you are used to working and being around other people. I was a baker up until I had my daughter, and even that, you know, being a baker can be a pretty solitary position in a restaurant because you usually go in early in the morning before most of the staff is there. But it's kind of perfect for me because I am very introverted and shy, and I do like my quiet solitude time. But it was kind of like half my shift I got to just like do my thing by myself, and then half the shift is when other people would start coming into the restaurant, and then I could socialize and be around other people. And I didn't really know any other young moms, and so I just realized, like, wow, this isn't quite what I thought it would be, being a stay-at-home. And I needed something to kind of pour myself into, to keep hold of myself, because I think it's just not talked about very often that just because you become a mom, that's not all of you. And if you try to make it all of you, then you lose yourself in it. You lose your identity as you try to fill the role of mother. And I think that can be really, really challenging. And I think there's some guilt that comes into that of like, well, shouldn't I just be happy just doing this? And I don't think that's true. And I had to kind of learn that the hard way of like, no, I can't just be this. I'm still me. I'm still this person. And although I now have this other little person that I love with my whole being, and she's my priority, I still am me, and I still have to like have an identity. Anyways, so also, thankfully, Olive is a lot like her father and loves to sleep. You know, there were mornings where I'd be like, she's gonna get up anytime soon. And she was a pretty good napper. Her brother, by the way, did not follow in her footsteps. So when she slept, I knit. And simultaneously, as I said, it was really hard financially, though, that first year. And I really wanted to be able to keep knitting because it was part of who I was. I found it to be a really, really good stress reliever, a way to connect to myself. I've shared a little bit as well. My daughter had to have surgery the day after she was born that we did not know about. It was a very, very, very hard, traumatic entrance into parenthood. So knitting really became a solace for me in that first year. But I was like, I can't afford to buy yarn, and I don't want to ask that of our limited financial resources. So really what happened is I was hoping to sell a couple patterns so I could still buy some yarn and just have like a little allowance for knitting. And so that is how I started my business with an 8-month-old, because I wanted to be able to knit during her naps, and I needed to pour my creativity into something since I was no longer baking. And so I just tried it. I put a pattern out there, and here we are now, 7 years later. So, and I guess what I'll say is, where there is a will, there is a way. And also, when you have had to work from a very young age, I think a strong work ethic helps. You know, I did not sleep much, and I tried to capitalize on every moment that I could in those early days. All right, spinning wheel versus e-spinner. I'm just beginning to enter the world of spinning, and I'm trying to decide between a matchless wheel or an e-spinner. What do you recommend for someone just starting out on this adventure? So I picked this question because I have a matchless and I have an e-spinner. So it's one of the few. I'm certainly no wheel expert, but having both of those, I have some comparisons. Depending on the e-spinner. So I will say, in my research, the Shacked Matchless spinning wheel is definitely on the higher, depending on accessories and all that, can be on the higher range of the price spectrum for a wheel. And depending on which e-spinner you get, those vary wildly from, I think, like a couple $100s up into the thousands as well. So price wise, depending on which e-spinner you got, my e-spinner and my Matchless were very comparable in price. So financially they can be quite similar. Space wise, the e-spinner is obviously going to be smaller. I have mine right here. So, you know, it's the size of a shoebox, you know. It is heavy, so don't think this thing's going to be light. It's not as heavy as my Matchless, but I was surprised how dense it is. I have a handspun e-spinner, and I find that for me, I prefer spinning on a fully manual wheel. I find that it is a lot easier for me to control everything when I am controlling the speed and the starting and the stopping with my feet. Waiting for a motor to slow down or speed up is just a very different thing for me than treadling. You know, I love in the morning to wake up with a cup of coffee and do some spinning. And when I'm at my Matchless, I can just stop treadling, take a sip of coffee and start treadling again. Where with my e-spinner, I have to push the button and wait for it to like slow down, you know? So that's actually been one of like the trickier things. The rhythm I have found I have gotten into actually is I tend to spin my singles on my Matchless, and then I tend to ply everything on my e-spinner. Now, one thing I will say I love about the e-spinner is when you are figuring out some plying things, such as chain plying, I loved not having to think about my feet. I learned how to chain ply on the e-spinner because I could really just focus on what my hands were doing. That being said, I've had my Matchless longer than I've had my e-spinner, and so I think I'm more comfortable with my Matchless. I think I am still getting the hang of the e-spinner. I need to spend some more time with it and just continue learning how to deal with the parts of it that I'm not in control of in the same way that I'm in control of the Matchless. But I think that both are great. I'll say that the Matchless, I think you can really do pretty much all the different kinds of spinning that you would want to do, you could do on that wheel. You know, you can get a jumbo flyer and bobbin. So if you want to do art yarns, if you want to do use that for plying, I use it for plying. I don't really do art yarns. Then it works great. I think that you could also do, you can see the orifice on this e-spinner is quite large. So you could definitely do some bigger chunky yarns on here as well. So I love both. But if I only was going to have one and did not have like taking away all other factors, because again, the nice thing about an e-spinner too is that it doesn't take, it's a more limited range of motion. You're only using your hands. But if I took out all those other factors, I think there's just part of me that loves getting away from like electronics and technology and things like that. So I think a manual wheel will probably always have my heart. You know, I'm also somebody who like loves to like walk and ride a bicycle as opposed to a car and things like that. So that might just be in my nature. But yeah, I hope some of that feedback maybe gives you an idea of what might suit you better, thinking about space, price points, and what you want to achieve with your wheel. All right, next question was, sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on time now that I got a little excited with the questions today. I'm not gonna lie, we have more questions than usual, so I will try not to get too distracted here. Okay, was just wondering if you ever did a video on just spinning. I am a new spinner and I'm having a lot of trouble getting the fiber to spin without always breaking. Can you please help me? So I don't have any videos on just spinning. I have not shown, I've had a couple couple people say, where are your videos on me like actually spinning? I, right now, especially, I'm not a spinning teacher. I'm a spinning newbie. So I don't know that I have any plans to show myself actually spinning, because I also don't want to like misguide anybody. You know, maybe someday we'll show just sneak peeks of just me in general spinning. You can see me making Rolex in an Instagram reel we did the other week. But so I had that problem though. And it is so frustrating when your fiber keeps breaking and you're like, why? So one thing I will say, I don't know what you're spinning on, but for me, I use Scotch tension. And what I had to realize was I had to turn that break down, because it was just pulling my yarn in faster than I could put twist in to hold my yarn together. And in the beginning, it's just figuring it out. As you can see, I also had some problems with over twisting, and probably needed to turn that break up. But if your fiber is just constantly breaking, it needs more twist to lock together before it gets sucked into your wheel. So try turning the break down, or using a smaller whirl that will allow you to put more twist in, or treadling faster. Try one of those things. I wouldn't try all three at once. I would just try one and just try to slowly see if little by little you can correct to get to a place. And you know, I think that, at least from my experience, and I think probably a lot of spinners feel this way, when you are learning, it feels like the wheel is going to take the yarn from you, and we kind of hold it with a death grip, and we kind of probably treadle fast, and just realizing like now I can go real slow, and I can give myself time to like watch those fibers spin up on each other. Like it will get easier, and it won't feel so like, oh, you know, it'll start to be like, oh, okay, I don't have to go so fast. I can go slow and kind of take my time and watch what's happening. Like, try and actually see what's happening. But at the end of the day, you need enough twist so that fiber doesn't fall apart before it gets sucked into the machine. And if your break is up really high, and that was mine, I just tried. There was a certain, I was shown to what an ideal spot might be for the spring on my Scotch tension, and it was like slightly opened. I don't think I've ever had it that far open again since I realized like, oh, that was just way too much tension. It was pulling that fiber right out of my hands before I could get twist in it. So I hope that helps. There are tons of resources out there though. Again, I have linked these in past videos. A quick Google search, YouTube search, you will definitely find videos on spinning. But I love School of Sweet Georgia. I've taken now almost all their spinning classes, and they are all fabulous. And then also Craftsy has some great ones. I just finished up Jillian Moreno's Plying to Knit class, was really good, and also Worsted to Woolen Drafting by JC Boggs. She's the person who started Ply Magazine. Both were great classes. So if you need some visuals, I recommend checking that out. If you don't have a local shop you can go to maybe get some one-on-one help, because that too is so valuable. If you can find any spinners, either a guild or a fiber shop, anybody in your area, having somebody be able to watch you, they could probably then help you adjust your wheel so that it's working with you instead of you two fighting each other. Okay. So I've gotten this question a lot. How did you teach yourself Continental after years on English knitting? So I'm just going to go through this kind of question by question. I started by just knitting colorwork with both hands. That is how I dipped my toes into Continental knitting, and I really think it set me up for success. So if you like knitting stranded colorwork, I recommend giving that a go. It's not for everybody. Not everyone likes knitting it with both hands, but what it did for me is it helped me to not overthink carrying the yarn in my left hand. It really just helped me to like kind of chill out a little bit and relax into the process. How long did it take you to be comfortable knitting Continental? So I then had a bit of a sped up learning curve because I began teaching, and I realized very early on that I needed to be able to show techniques in both English and Continental styles while teaching. So I kind of had to do a little bit of a crash course. I would say it took a year to be very proficient, and I can't even tell you how long it took till I switched, because I never intended to switch how I knit. I do knit primarily Continental now, but that wasn't my intention. It just happened. One day I just realized, oh, I'm not picking up my yarn in my right hand anymore. So I would say that was somewhere between a year and a year and a half, but those are also early motherhood days, so it's all kind of a blur. What type of project did you learn on? Because I seem to like to really challenge myself, I actually taught myself while learning brioche. I don't recommend that. It's just what I was knitting at the time. But if I was actually going to give advice, I would say knit something in stockinette. The body of a sweater would be great, because it's like a big circumference of just knitting. Simpler projects, maybe a hat, socks, anything like that where you can just get the rhythm. I definitely do recommend having a project that you are only working on Continental. Don't switch back and forth between English and Continental in one project, because most likely you won't have the same gauge in both knitting styles, so your project's going to end up wonky. So just have like one simple project. A shawl would be great, especially like a garter stitch shawl or something like that would be great, just to get the rhythm of it. And then this just flows right into another knitter's question that I just put them together, also about Continental. This knitter chose to learn Continental to speed up my knitting and accomplish bigger projects. I've been doing okay with the switch, but I'm having a terrible time keeping my attention consistent, which bothers me to no end. Any tips or tricks to help with this? Do I just need more time to get the feel of it? So you already know the answer. You just need more time to get the feel for it. I will say, because I get it a lot, people are like, I want to speed up. I want to knit faster. And so they switch to Continental. I knit way faster as an English knitter. Now, yes, I can knit fast Continental, but it could not touch my English speed for a few years. Especially because I had been knitting English for so long. I can do that in my sleep, with my eyes closed. Like, I just can feel everything. Still to this day, I am better without at all needing to look. I can do most knitting functions, English better than I could do Continental. Continental, and I've now been knitting Continental for a few years, like 4 or 5, still will need to look down at my work more often. So just keep that in mind. But yes, you really hit the nail on the head. It's just practice. It's just your body finding that rhythm. Just like you probably got to a place of a good rhythm and speed with your English knitting, it's the same with Continental. The nice thing about Continental is it is less of a hand movement. That is why it's called picking, because it's just this little grabbing that yarn in. So it's not as kind of this as English. The English isn't anything like this, but you know what I mean, hopefully. Okay, so yeah, just keep going, you'll get it, and that tension will even out. One thing to consider, general rule of thumb, Continental knitting will be looser than English. English knitters tend to knit tighter. So if this is you, or if you're like, oh, my tension looks like funky, like what's going on here, you might just need to size down a needle. You just are probably looser. So that's something to consider too, is making sure that you're knitting on the appropriate needle now that you have switched. Okay. I am so curious about spinning, but there is not enough room in our apartment for me to introduce more fiber equipment. Have you ever done drop spindle? I just acquired a bunch of roving, and I thought I might try my hand at drop spindle. There's not an LYS near me. Oh, I'm just gonna skip forward to the end of this. Thanks so much for any suggestions you may have for a wannabe spinster with limited space. So I have not done drop spindle, and I actually get a lot of drop spindle questions. So I did want to touch on that. I've never tried it. And I would love, love, love for any of you who have, who do, who don't anymore, who are gonna start right now, Please let us know in the comments how you feel about drop spindling, how you would compare it if you both drop and wheel spindle. Do you think it's a good place to start? I get that one a lot. I get a ton of people asking, should I start with a drop spindle and then do a wheel? I didn't. I went straight to the wheel. So I think that's just the path I landed on, because I was actually gifted a spinning wheel back when I lived in New Zealand, and sadly don't have that wheel anymore. But I had never thought about learning how to spin. And my partner at the time was the one who thought of it and got me that as a birthday present. And I think that's what planted the seed for me. So when I was ready to learn how to spin again and give it a try, I landed right back at the wheel, because that's where it kind of began for me. But I would be so curious about a drop spindle. Like, A, their affordability. B, they take up no space. C, I forgot what I was gonna say. What was I gonna say? Portability. They don't take up a lot of space. Oh, financial accessibility. You know, I think spindles are way more affordable than wheels. So I am just so curious. I would really love to hear other people's experiences with spindles and what you think of them. The other thing I will say is there are some tiny little wheels these days. I actually just got introduced to the Louette Victoria yesterday by my friend Casey at Port Fiber. Oh my goodness, this little tiny wheel is 8 pounds. It is so portable, and it folds up into like nothing. Like, it fits in a little backpack. So I only say this not to deter you from the drop spindle route, but to also know that, like, you don't have to consider yourself completely out of luck when it comes to the wheel route. If you did, there's also some really tiny little e-spinners, but just something to consider. If you didn't know, there's actually some space friendly wheels out there as well. Okay, this is a long one. I just wanted to answer all the things today, so I hope you found it helpful. I don't really have any show and tell today. I'm doing 2 sweater spins, and I'm like, oh, I don't really have anything to show. I will say, I think I showed these. This is that marl I'm working on, and I am trying to decide. I can't remember if I told y'all last week, but I kind of overcompensated. My first skein I spun up is this one. And I don't know if you can tell, but you can definitely see my inconsistencies. Hello, new long drawn spinner. So you can see where it's like a little looser, a little fluffier. But I did not ply this up as tightly as I then plied the next skein. So if I hold them next to each other, what happens for me, and I don't know if you can really see it, but this skein looks darker to me because the ply twist is stronger. The ply angle is more severe. So I don't know. I'm thinking about running this one back through my wheel. I actually plied them on my e-spinner, but I think if I ran it back through, I would do it on my matchless, so I felt like I was in more control to tighten up some of these areas. Do you see how loose right here? I feel like I need to add a little more twist to some areas, but I'm kind of afraid to do that. So I don't know. Anyway, so I'm working right now. I've already finished spinning up the rest of the light blue singles, and now I just have to spin up 2 bobbins of those dark blue, and I will be done with all the singles. I'll just have to ply. My other sweater spin is it's a slog. It is gonna take me a long time. I'm spinning it pretty fine. That's the CVM from Michigan, from Never Say Never Farm. And I mean, it took me to spin up like not even half a bobbin, took me like 3 times as long as it took me to spin up the 2 bobbins of this long draw singles. So yeah, but I think I'm gonna take a break after I get through before I ply the remainder of my marled project, I think I might take a little break and spin up this amazing braid. I think it's called Peacockiatis. So this is Dorset combed top from Akara Yarns, and she was telling me, her name's Rose, and she was telling me how it's great for socks. And so I think I am gonna spin this up for socks, and I might even do it on my e-spinner because as I told you, I kind of have like turned it into my plying wheel, but I do really wanna get more comfortable with the nuances of it. I want to be able to use it, especially because it's a lot easier to move around my house or to take with me to places. So I wanna get more comfortable with it. So I might even spin it up, do this whole project on that. Especially because my big wheel is tied up with all these sweater spins. So that's where I'm at with my spinning. And I also need to get some knitting done, to be quite frank. I really need to get some knitting done. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you're still here 45 minutes later, just listening to me ramble on about all the fibery goodness, thank you so much. I hope you have a great weekend. As always, I hope it involves some making and maybe some getting outside and just taking some time for you. I just found a new tea. It's a chamomile lavender from Traditional Medicinals. Highly recommend. I'm gonna go make a cup right now. So I will see you next week back here. Bye.